All right, to whoever is going to be listening to this, my name is Jeremy Kelly, and I'm joined with my old college friend John Curcio. Say hello, John.
Hey, how's it going? Thank you for getting my name pronunciation correct.
So we were both students at Ramapo College of New Jersey, and while we were there, we had the idea of just filming ourselves talking about the Halloween movies, just for shits and giggles, basically. But we never got around to doing it, and obviously, it makes more sense 5, 6 years later to do a podcast of ourselves doing it from opposite ends of the country, right, John?
Yeah, it's kind of ironic, because when we were having this conversation, Halloween was sort of kind of dead in the water by the time we were chatting about it. Like you and I just kind of, shooting the shit, chatting about it back in college. And, I mean, you could always talk about this franchise regardless whether it's going or not. But it's kind of ironic that you contacted me to do this again only about 2 weeks before the big news that Jamie Lee Curtis and John Carpenter were coming back to the franchise. So it seems like kind of fate stepped in on that one.
Yeah, that was just the biggest coincidence you could have asked for. I mean, I had read talk that they were trying to make another one, but you hear talk like that all the time.
Of
But
course.
then to read that it was Jamie Lee Curtis coming back to be in it, it's like, holy smokes, where did this come from?
Yeah, hearing Jamie Lee coming back to Halloween is like finding out Sigourney Weaver's coming back to Aliens, or most recently, as we just found out, Linda Hamilton is coming back to Terminator. It's kind of funny. It's like a resurrection of all the old school badass chicks coming back into the woodwork. But yeah, that I mean, we could just take credit. Maybe our conversation, tempted the fates and the gods to work things in our favor. That's why Jamie Lee Curtis is coming back. We'll just take full credit for it and say it was all us.
Sure, sure, yeah, we'll take a, special thanks credit for the next movie.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, hopefully John Carpenter will mention us in the credits.
All right, so I guess we might as well get started from where it began. Now, how old would you say you were when you first became acquainted with these movies?
Oh my God! It's ironic. I was just chatting about this with a friend the other day. The my first experience, it was probably the first horror film I ever watched. Actually, in general, I don't really count the Universal horror films because my mother always felt they were tame enough to be able to show me. So I grew up on Dracula and Frankenstein and all that. But actually, it was my brother's birthday party. I have an older brother, and he liked to torment me when I was younger, and so he had his idiot friends over, and they had Halloween, a VHS of Halloween, and I heard the theme song playing from the downstairs rec room, and that theme song sent a cold chill up my spine. I remember being like utterly terrified just simply hearing the musical cue, and the opening credits. And curious me, I had to go down and take a look. So my brother ended up actually kind of like keeping me there, like kind of like taunting me to stick around and watch a few minutes. And so I watched the opening, and I got just after he killed his sister and the clown mask was ripped off, and you see that it was a small boy. That kind of ruined me for a bit. I'm not gonna lie. I had to leave after that, and just knowing that honestly, just knowing the film was playing in the house was unsettling enough. I was like, ooh, how old was I? I was probably like maybe 6 years old, 7 years old. Like it definitely had a lasting impression, but kind of like going on roller coasters after the exhilaration and adrenaline through that fear kicks in, you want to do it again. So even though that it petrified me, there was also sort of like there was something alluring about it. So it was probably my first experience being thrilled by a horror film. So John Carpenter in many ways was my introduction to the genre.
That's the way I think a lot of the best horror films are. Like that they frighten you, but you just want to keep coming back for more.
Oh, exactly. The good ones definitely make you want to keep coming back for more. The bad ones make you just want to kind of shut it off, and then never watch them again. Which a lot of the imitators are guilty of. But that's another conversation.
I don't have nearly as interesting a story. I actually didn't grow up with horror movies. I didn't really watch them until later. In fact, the franchise that I became acquainted with first was probably Friday the 13th, and
Hmm.
then eventually over time I discovered Halloween, and Yeah, I have to admit that the first time I saw the original from 1978, I wasn't that enamored by it. Like, I just didn't totally get why it was considered a classic. I mean, I think it's one of those movies where it needs a little bit of time to sort of stick with you, and then you start to notice, just in terms of the suspense and the atmosphere and the music, of course, that
Absolutely.
it's really a fantastic piece.
Yeah, no, it's a brilliant movie. I think I've referenced this before on another podcast, but whenever I'm talking about a classic, particularly something like Halloween, um, uh, I think about I used to watch Turner Classic Movies all the time, and they used to have guest introductions. And Sidney Pollack was introducing Citizen Kane, and at the beginning of it, normally these intros run about 5 minutes long, but the intro was actually very rapid. He goes, "There's really nothing I could say about this movie that hasn't been said already." He's like, "It's a masterpiece. It's brilliant. It's fantastic. It's influential," and I feel that way about the first Halloween. It's just sort of like I could definitely talk in detail about what I love about it, but when talking about recommending it and giving it high praise, it's like I simply give it the highest praise. I think it's an excellent movie. There's almost like so little to say about it.
Yeah, I mean, the best way to really describe it is just to point out almost every scene about it, but just everything from the dialogue by Donald Pleasance as Sam Loomis, and of course the
Exactly.
way that Jamie Lee Curtis in her final chase scene with Michael Myers. And for me, the most harrowing scene is when she hides in the closet, and Michael starts trying to break in, and she has to grab a coat hanger to fend him off.
Yeah, and you can tell how powerful that moment was because of how often it's mimicked throughout the series. They even go back to it in H2O when Jamie Lee Curtis comes back. They have a habit of they love homaging that. I think that's one of their favorite moments. Speaking about Donald Pleasance's performance, I mean he has a lot to do with the success of the movie because uh, to use a word that Richard Donner likes to use a lot, of verisimilitude and honesty and earnestness. And with a story like this, where it could get really hokey very quickly when you have a psychiatrist who's supposed to be a man of science and a man of reason, and a man of education, and he's basically flat out telling you that there is no quantifiable understanding of Michael Myers. Michael Myers is beyond comprehension. He's a myth, He's death. He's walking death. To hear like a man who's supposed to be, a healer, a medicine man. He's a doctor. He's a psychiatrist. He's supposed to be a man of reason, and he's the most reasonable man in the movie because he actually sees past all of that and knows exactly what Michael is. And I was actually just saying to my roommate earlier today that the parts that actually frightened me the most when I was a kid and still sends chills up my spine isn't even scenes with Michael in it. It's actually the scene, particularly the scene with Dr. Loomis talking to Sheriff Brackett about Michael and the Devil's Eyes speech. The music, the beats that Donald Pleasance is hitting as an actor, the flow and the dialogue, the atmosphere, the lighting, everything in that scene is perfect because without even having the villain there, the level of suspense and fear is growing purely through dialogue, and the threat is getting incredibly more immense. We're going beyond that. This is a mental patient that's escaped from an asylum. This is something mythic. This is something that no one can understand, and that to me is the most frightening thing in the world. The stuff that you can't understand, the stuff that you can't comprehend. That's why I think The Exorcist a few years earlier was also very successful in creating this fear through the unknown, because it's what you don't see that is far more frightening than what you do see. And I think that's why Carpenter didn't show Michael too much. That's why they refer to him in the credits as the Shape. He's not Michael Myers. He's the Shape. He's a silhouette. He's blackness, darkness incarnate, and the Grim Reaper essentially. So I think that building the threat through dialogue is one of the probably the most cleverest things. It's one of those things that goes back to when you're talking about independent filmmaking. Uh, when you have less money and less opportunity, it forces you to be more creative. So Carpenter and Deborah Hill made sure that that script really popped and made sure that every scene that Michael wasn't in, the build was there, that you felt his presence.
Yeah, it's far from just his physical presence that makes him so effective. It's just the way he's built up. And this is sort of off topic, but it's actually one of my favorite little moments of the movie. It's really nothing significant, but it's when he's outside of Michael's house. And these kids come by and they're trying to dare each other to go inside, and Loomis sort of whispers at them to scare them off, and then then they run, and the way he just gives this weird little smile as if to say, "Yeah, look what I did just now."
Yeah, I think I love that moment. It's a really nice. It's a quirky moment that I think was really necessary because at that point Loomis is very. He's always doom and gloom. He's a bit of a downer, isn't he? Like every scene he's in, he's telling everybody they're wrong and that they're gonna die and that the streets are gonna be filled with blood, and he's really a downer. But that moment where he it's twofold. He's kind of protecting those kids by making sure they don't go in there, but he's having a little bit of fun in the meantime. And that little smile shows that he's a guy. He's a man. He's not all he's not all Professor Van Helsing. He's a little bit more than that. So I appreciated that moment, and that's going back to Carpenter's brilliance is he understands character. If he was just all doom and gloom and constantly talking about all the darkness and the evil, he becomes one note and not very interesting. So that was a nice little bit of acting, and also it makes you feel a little bit more safer with him. And I think that's why at the end when you see Loomis hearing the screams from the house, you're relieved that he's there. Uh, I feel like having him just giving dark speeches the whole movie would have made him an overly dark character and not as warm and welcoming as he becomes after a certain point.
Yeah, for as dumb as these movies got, and we'll get to that later,
Oh
he
yeah.
was always a welcome, dignified presence.
Oh, absolutely. I'd say he's the reason why I watch the sequels as often as I do. I mean, I not that I mean I do like a few of the sequels, but some of the ones that aren't particularly good, like I could still enjoy them because of his presence in the movie, and he has that warmth about him where you're just really glad to see him. And it must have been it was probably a bit of a coup for Pleasance because he kind of had gotten typecast as villains a lot. I think he was Blofeld in the Bond series, so I mean
Yeah,
he was an iconic villain in pop culture, and to have it
and
switched
he was
up.
in the Great Escape too, wasn't he?
Oh, he's amazing in The Great Escape. Yeah, he was actually a real life POW at some point. He actually fought in the war, and he actually helped consult on The Great Escape from his experience.
Now, is there anything that you think doesn't work about the movie? Like the only thing that isn't very good is probably the actors for Linda and Annie, and actually most of those scenes are just kind of fluff, and a lot of dialogue that doesn't have to do with Michael is pretty lame at times.
Yeah, but that's the thing is, yeah, but that's also we are speaking from a male gaze, so like for us, there really aren't the only male characters in the movies that I mean, you can't even say we relate to, but that we have are Brackett and Loomis, and when we're watching them as kids, they're sort of our father's age, so. There's no real connection there. Then you have Tommy, so I guess Tommy's a little, but he's just the kid. He's very much an ancillary character. But when it comes to the three main characters, yeah, the dialogue is definitely it could be a little groaning, but at the same time, I appreciated that Deborah Hill kind of added a female sensibility to it. I know that was definitely one of her like that was something she really wanted to contribute was to make these girls sound real. So that's why they're talking about kind of innocuous bullshit. They're talking about boys. They're talking about and they do have they're the stereotypes, right? There's three of them,
Yeah,
so one of them is a slut, one is the middle ground, and then the other one is the saint. So
right.
you have the perfect triangle. Their chemistry is really good. Like I actually believe that they're friends, despite the fact that they have three very different personalities. So I do appreciate that. In terms of when I think of my negatives, it's interesting. Like I never thought to think about that because I mean, even thinking about because that would really only lend me to thinking about their restrictions, and I can't really fault them for their restrictions because they were working with only 320 grand, and considering their restrictions, I think they did a really killer job, no pun intended, and I've actually I live since I live in SoCal. I've actually I've driven in the town that doubled for Haddonfield,
Okay.
and it's eerie being there because it's like it really is Haddonfield, despite the fact that it's Southern California. It feels like a Midwestern town has been transplanted to Southern California, so I appreciated that.
Just real quick, were most of the original houses still there? Like I think I heard that the original Myers house is now a chiropractor's office or something.
I honestly, you know what's sad? Even though I've driven through that town, I actually have not visited the locations yet, but I'm going to do that this year. I'm definitely like every Halloween I say I want to do something fun, and I'm like, I live in the area. Why don't I go visit the Halloween location? So I'm definitely going to be doing that. I've had friends who've gone to their houses. I forget which ones are still standing and which ones are where, but with quick little bit of research, I'm definitely gonna take a look. But going back to your initial question, yeah, I don't really, apart from maybe if you look hard enough, you could see some palm trees. I hate to call anything a flawless movie, but yeah, I'd say that the acting sometimes can be a little bit stilted, but at the same time, I think there something really works about it. There's an innocence about the girls, even though they're not so innocent, but you know what I mean, the high school innocence of just it's Halloween. They want to have some fun. They want to drink. They want to fool around. There's really nothing wrong with that. So I don't really mind that they could be a little bit ditzy because in this case, like you understand why they're not. Everyone in the theater watching Halloween would be like yelling at Linda, don't like because she's talking to Michael under the sheet, and they're like, oh, how run or something like that. But when you're a normal person in an average situation, you're not assuming there's a serial killer under the sheet. You're assuming that you're getting teased. So even that, I kind of forgive it. So yeah, I can't really even think of anything that takes me out of the movie. That's Halloween is one of the movies that from the second the opening titles start and that music hits up until the very last moment, I am completely engrossed. So, I think it's just a near perfect movie.
Yeah, there's nothing that really bothers me about the movie. I mean, from what I said before, it's just kind of a little bit of nitpicking, and I do agree with what you said that the movie's supposed to start kind of like innocent and unassuming, and then just ramp up by the end, pretty much.
Yeah, yeah. The ending, I think, is one of the most perfect bookends I've ever seen in a movie. If they never made another Halloween after that, it would have been perfect. I mean, I'm not going to be one of those purists who says like as far as I'm concerned, it ends there. The ending is brilliant. Nowadays, obviously, I think if you showed this movie to someone who hasn't seen Halloween before, they're kind of expecting Michael to not be there because the unstoppable killer has become such a cliche. But at the time, the killers in these horror films were still human. Norman Bates went to prison at the end. You know, Leatherface catches his own chainsaw on his leg and screams in agony. He's human, and they can be defeated. They can be killed.
And in Black Christmas, the killer's never really caught either.
Yeah, the killer is never really caught, and I think that's one of the most admirable traits about that movie. And you could tell that Halloween definitely has some inspiration from that movie. I think that having that moment where Loomis looks over the balcony and the body is gone and the music kicks in, it to this day, no matter how many times I've seen this movie, maybe 1,000 times, no matter how many times I watch it, it still gets me. It gives me goosebumps every time, and it's everything. It's such a perfect moment. You initially have that look of shock from Loomis, and then Laurie begins to break down and cry, and then you see this look on his face where Loomis's shock turns into I knew this was going to happen, which was such an interesting acting choice. From what I heard, I think Donald Pleasance farmed out the idea to Carpenter and said, "Dude, do you want this to be shocked or do you want this to be I knew this was going to happen. And Carpenter said, why don't you play around with both of them? So that's why initially he's shocked when he looks over the balcony, but then he has that look of, the game is on. I knew this was going to happen. This is going to continue. It's so brilliant. And then a detail that I didn't notice until, well, I mean, I've seen this movie so many times over the years, but like a number of years ago, I noticed I finally really started paying attention that apart from the score, when you're looking at all the locations of all the murders and everything that's occurred in the film up until that point, Michael's breathing is very present in the background, and it's the feeling of unease that he can be anywhere, he could be everywhere, he is death, So it is such a perfect way to end that movie. And like I said, if they had never done another one afterwards, it would be a perfectly bookended movie. It would just be you wondering for the rest of time what happened to Michael Myers. Did he continue to kill? Did he disappear, never to be seen again? It's such a great ending.
One last thing to bring up, and then we'll move on. Is the mask,
Oh yeah.
the the iconic mask, which I think it's common knowledge at this point, but it was basically a William Shatner Captain Kirk mask that
Yes.
they painted white and then cut out the eye holes.
Yes.
I heard that they had two different ideas for the mask. One was that, and one was a basic clown mask that was present in the opening.
Yeah. Well, clowns are all the rage right now. Now
Yeah,
that now,
if they had made this movie now, then they might have just decided to go with the clown mask instead.
that's entirely possible. Yeah. You see, what's funny about that is, me personally, clowns don't scare me, and and I just saw it recently. I think it's a great movie. It's a pretty damn good movie. And honestly, I was entertained by Pennywise the Clown. I was not frightened by him, but that's me. I'm kind of dead on the inside. But clowns never frightened me, so I don't think the movie would have nearly the same effect. Also, uh, it would have changed the entire movie. That mask really ended up dictating the temperature and the atmosphere of the whole film because by choosing a plain white dead stare of a face uh, and cutting out the eyes so you don't see pupils, it was all about you transferring your own fears onto it, and it kind of becomes anyone's boogeyman. And also because if it was a clown mask, there would be detail, there would be a frightening grimace to it, so they would probably want to show it more, and so the whole lighting design of the movie would probably have changed so you could see his mask more often. But by choosing a blank white face, you don't need to show it. You only have to show it in shadow. You could show it in profile. You could show it in silhouette, and that's what adds to the drama of the movie. So, I mean, thank God they didn't choose I think personally, if they chose the clown mask, I think that the movie probably still would have been. It still would have been good, but I think it would have been like a cult horror movie that, people would rediscover over the years, not the phenomenon that Halloween became. I really genuinely believe that The Mask probably ended up dictating the entire future of that franchise.
Yeah, like going by what you said, that it creates such an image because you see this guy, and all you see is this blank canvas of just inhumanity, basically. And
Exactly.
and 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 I think that's what Carpenter said he wanted in this character, that he wanted someone that no one would be able to relate to.
Exactly. Yeah. There's no personality. There's nothing there. It's completely blank, and also the brilliance of with Jason, he's using a hockey mask, and like the hockey mask is iconic now, but the hockey mask existed for years beforehand. By taking a Captain Kirk mask and painting it white, they essentially created a brand new image, like a completely it is completely original to Halloween, despite the fact that they technically used a trademarked mask. By making those corrections, by trimming the sideburns off of it, cutting out the eye holes, painting it white, and messing with the hair color, they ended up creating an iconic image, something that's wholly original to the franchise. And speaking of the mask, I mean, I'll just get one of my gripes out of the way right now. It frustrates me the terrible reproductions of the mask over the years. I think that sometimes the franchise just didn't realize that that it couldn't just be any white mask. They needed, there was something about that mask in particular that worked, and I really feel like Michael's villainy and presence and fright tends to lessen if his mask is weak looking. Fortunately, the first two had that great iconic mask.
Yeah, I think the second one was the only sequel that used the exact same mask, but they kept having to get different ones for the next ones. And I think the worst ones were probably in 4 and
Yeah.
actually H2O, but because you just saw his eyes way too much in that movie.
Yes, yeah, I agree, and I have a little bit of trivia for that when we get to those movies. So yeah, that I definitely I agree. The fourth one I think is probably the worst of the series. It's because though I think it's there's something almost, is it a strong word to use? It's something kind of offensive about it. It's like because it's Michael using an imitation mask, so it's
Right.
like he's using he's almost satirizing himself. You know what I mean? Like it just, I don't know. But that's I'll save that part for four.
All right, so we move on to Halloween 2, which came out in 1981. Now, this is one that a lot of people seem to think is close in spirit to the original, but it just doesn't do anything for me. I'm always just kind of bored by it.
It's a curious movie, that's for damn sure. Because it's just one of those things where it's like, because the whole cast, well, the whole cast, the surviving cast from the first film is back. Um, uh, and because the look and feel remains close enough to the first movie, I think that is the reason why a lot of people hold it, dear to their hearts. It is a strange movie too because Jamie Lee Curtis is bumped to top billing in the movie, and there is sort of a big coup of having her in the movie, but she's basically bedridden the whole time, and she only becomes an active character in the last few minutes, and even then it's not really an active character. She's running for her life.
Yeah.
She's not really doing anything of any vitality. So the movie basically once again rests on Donald Pleasance's shoulders. But the thing was, while the first film it rested on his shoulders because he was the most experienced and seasoned actor, in the second film it rests on his shoulders because Jamie Lee Curtis clearly didn't like the script, and I heard rumors that she kind of requested her role be limited, and of course she is wearing a not particularly great wig because I think she had chopped her hair off
Yeah.
at that point.
Yeah, I think I read that.
So yeah, I will say the charms about the film that I've appreciated over the years is, first off, I think the direction is pretty solid. I think Rick Rosenthal did a pretty decent job. I think he creates his own atmosphere, and I actually liked that he gives his movie a little bit more of an his about his own iconography. He plays with color a lot more than Carpenter. Carpenter kind of wanted to keep things very simple and clean, which I appreciated. But Rosenthal created this sort of really otherworldly elements, and the reason why I think it works is because in the absence of Laurie Strode as our heart of the movie, with only Loomis kind of running around getting a little bit more crazier than before, you kind of see Haddonfield descend into chaos. So Haddonfield essentially becomes a character in the movie. You have all these really strange, disparate storylines going on between, the medics who take Laurie, the nurses on staff, and then you have, like, the mother bringing her kid in because he hurt his tongue on one of the razors, and then you have, like, everything going on with Loomis and the sheriff's department and the press circus that's in front of the Myers house, and they're trying to burn the house down because they're basically turning into rioters from, like, the old Universal horror movies. I actually appreciated that sort of Haddonfield. You saw it descend into hell because of what was going on.
Yeah, I did like as the movies went on, you got to see Haddonfield as a bit more of a community than you had seen it in the first movie. I mean, in that one, it was only centered on a few certain characters, and I think that was partly for budget limitations, but they were able to do some more with that, I think, as time went on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the best things about the movie is that Haddonfield feels more populated, and I even liked, even though it's a bit contrived, I do like the bit of continuity that the boy that's accidentally struck by the police car and killed when Loomis is chasing after him, believing he's Michael, turns out to be Ben Tramer, who was the guy that Laurie had a crush on in the first movie. I liked that little bit of continuity, even though it's a bit contrived. That like I know it's a small town, but what are the odds the one guy that this saintly virgin wants to sleep with turns out to be the guy dressed up like the mass murderer who's about to get and then he gets horribly massacred. The image of the faux Michael stuck up against the ambulance burning alive, I never realized that was basically foreshadowing the finale of the movie, that was how Michael was going to go down. He was going to go down in flames, and I really appreciated that. But also that moment is really it's a pretty gut wrenching moment. It's like it's horrifying. Like Loomis is the hero of our movie, and he inadvertently gets a child killed. It's a pretty it's really rough when you think about it. And that's so like while Carpenter's film was more restrained, Rosenthal's film kind of goes off the rails, but it kind of works. It's the insanity that follows after everything kind of goes to shit, and I actually appreciate that. But obviously the movie definitely has its faults, but I think for what it was, I think Rosenthal worked well within the restraints he had to work within.
What's funny about that? I mean, you mentioned that when the police hit and kill Ben Tramer, that you said mistaking him to be Michael, but I'm not even sure if that's totally true because when they get the the cop who was driving the car out, he was babbling. He came out of nowhere,
Yeah.
but even though he was like walking in the middle of the road, so it's just a lot of like really strange, random things in this movie, and that actually kind of relates to the biggest plot development of the entire series that most of the rest of the movies were built around. We find out that Laurie Strode is actually Michael Myers' sister,
Yep.
which just kind of makes you wonder, well, what exactly is he doing then? I mean, it was, and I think a lot of people would agree that it was better when you didn't really know why he was killing all these people, but instead he's just kind of going to random places for no real reason.
Yeah, it's such a strange thing when you think about it. Listening to Carpenter talk about writing the screenplay for Halloween 2, he flat out admits he's even publicly thanked Budweiser for getting him through writing the script because he was drinking heavily trying to get him to come up with a good arc for the movie, and I think he realized that there needed to be something revelatory in this to justify its existence. Otherwise, you literally were just going to get a remake of one.
Yeah, but even then, it doesn't really amount to a whole much. At least not in this movie. I mean, we only find out toward the end when Loomis's nurse tells him, and then they decide, oh, we've got to find Laurie at the hospital. But I feel like they could have done that at pretty much any time before then.
Yeah, essentially, it is basically used to give Loomis his Sherlock Holmes moment where he puts it together and realizes that Michael is not killing sporadically. He's actually killing with a purpose, and he has a target, and that gives him finally it gives him a place he can it gives him a lead. Because the rest of the film he's running around town giving the same speeches that he gave in the first movie, which
The only
it
difference
becomes
is that
really
now
hokey.
he's talking to a deputy the
A
whole time.
deputy. It's hysterical. It's like it's almost as if Rosenthal was like and Carpenter were like, you know what, like we have no real usable, we have nothing really to give Loomis to do, so let's kind of just have him rehash a lot of his old speeches. But they're like, yeah, but he's already spoken to Brackett, so they made that disconnect with him and Brackett, so that Brackett goes home for the rest of the night. And I'm like, I'm still frustrated by that because they had such potential for a really interesting character moment with Brackett. Like, I love Charles Cyphers. He's like one of those, old school B movie character actors. And one thing I'll give the zombie Halloween 2 is that at least Brad Dourif, Sheriff Brackett, picks up his weapon and says, I'm going to go kill this motherfucker.
Yes.
Brackett, on the other hand, just goes home for the rest of the night, and surfer boy deputy ends up becoming Loomis's his resources, and once again, he's giving the long-winded speeches, but they've lost their effect now because if you've seen one, which I'm sure you have if you're watching two, you're kind of like, okay, this was scary the first time, and now it's just kind of like now you're just blowing smoke. But going back to the twist, I mean, this was I don't think it had any influence, but this was 80 or 81.
81.
So this was 1 year after The Empire Strikes Back, where the biggest twist in cinema history was Luke, I am your father. So I don't know if that had played any part in it, or if Carpenter just simply felt I need an excuse, a justification for this movie to exist. Why is this still happening? Why is Laurie still the center of attention? And especially if she's just kind of a lummox laying in bed the whole time, like what does it mean? So in that sense, I understand why he did it, but that ended ironically enough, as I was saying, how The Mask ended up dictating the whole franchise. The next biggest thing was this twist, because by making Laurie Michael's sister, that becomes the character now. Michael is no longer the killer of anyone and anything who gets in his way. I mean, he will, but now he's methodical. He has a plan. He has designs on Laurie and people who are related to him, and it just kind of spirals out of control, because it first starts with Laurie, but then they create a daughter for her, and then they created the cult of Thorn, and it becomes very convoluted. So in many ways, creating the familial connection, while it differentiates Michael from Jason and Freddy, it also kind of damns the series to force itself to constantly involve family members. Ironically, the only movie after this point, apart from three, that breaks away from that is the worst one, in my opinion, which is Resurrection, because after Laurie's gone at the beginning of the film, he's going after a bunch of nobodies, but that's a terrible movie. So I don't know how I feel at this point. It is kind of iconic, and it H2O did it right. They treated the familial connection as something. They showed Laurie suffering from PTSD, and they actually played with it more. And I think that they kind of corrected it there. But yeah, him making that twist, that kind of while it's been a blessing and a curse on the franchise since it was created.
Yeah, it's what gave all these sequels a reason for existing, basically.
Yeah, which I get, like, once again, is a blessing. It's also a curse because you have to keep explaining all these different relatives of Michael, and it becomes it becomes satirical after a bit. There is something about giving an origin and giving a modus operandi to a very mythical villain. Like, I think the reason why people connect to the Joker so much from Nolan's Dark Knight is because, you know, uh, his backstory keeps changing because he's lying, and you don't know where he comes from. You don't know what caused this, what caused him to become this way, and that makes him so much more terrifying because he's not a person; he's a force of nature, and that's what Michael was. Michael is as much a force of nature as the shark in Jaws. It exists to feed essentially, but now with that connection to Laurie Strode, it's now that all that goes out the window, and it's no, this is just a man with a grudge. This is a man who wants to kill his bloodline. For what reason, we don't know, and that's kind of scary. But at the same time, you're humanizing him a bit um, by making it about family. And I think Halloween 5 is probably the biggest uh, uh, perpetrator of humanizing Michael too much, and in a very awkward and just and horrible way. But that's for later. But
We'll get to that.
yeah, exactly. But going back to two, I think it has good moments, but it does become a slog during the second act. The second act is extremely boring, and things only ramp up again towards the end once we get the reveal of Laurie being the sister. I will say this: one scene in Halloween 2 that continually uh, creeps me out, that I think is probably the scariest moment in the movie, does actually stretch back to the twist, which is when Laurie is having her catatonic dream, and you see her as a young girl, and she walks towards Michael sitting in the chair. Michael turns around as a boy and looks at her and smiles. That I still fucks my head up so badly. Like that seeing Michael as a child, I think, is one of the most terrifying things. Knowing that this innocent looking boy is pure evil is terrifying. So, while I'm kind of dissing the twist at the same time, my favorite scene in the movie kind of stems from that.
Overall, I think even though, as we said, the original never really needed a sequel, if you want to know like more about what happened that night, it's fine enough. I mean, and it was meant to be, you know, just the rest of that night, and it was supposed to end with
Yeah.
that. I mean, it's probably the most definitive way that they killed Michael by having Loomis basically blow both of them up and just leaving him burning on the floor.
It is a perfect, yeah. It is actually, even though the movie it definitely dips in quality from the first one. I think that it definitely has it has some merit in some cases. For instance, the ending, I do think the ending is very strong. Michael and Loomis going out together, I think, is perfect. It's such a it's Captain Ahab going down with the ship, trying to destroy the whale. I really appreciate that. And there is something also, another thing, another hallmark that Halloween 2 added to the franchise is the use of Mr. Sandman, which I think is really eerie because it's there's something about that song that's like, it was supposed to be, it's kind of this upbeat 50s or 60s song that's become so, you get icky thinking about that song, and I'm actually glad that they brought it back in H2O. There's something about it that's just so unsettling. Even Rob Zombie brought it into his version. I
Yeah,
I I, I like
even
that.
though it was kind of a slowed down version, but
Yeah.
but yeah, it was still there.
Yeah, yeah, but overall, I think two is fine. I think that of the sequels, I think it's one of the better ones. Like I said, I think it's well directed in areas. I do think they go a little too hard on the violence, like making up for the lack of violence in the first film, and now competing with an oversaturated market of slasher films.
Yeah, because this was just after we got the first Friday the 13th that really just took the gore uh, to the next level from where it had been before.
Exactly. So in a weird way, Halloween finds itself imitating its imitators, and I think that's where the movie kind of loses me a bit. Like the whole thing with the syringe sticking out of the doctor's eye and everything, and the head nurse laying in that very hammer horror red blood. It doesn't look real. There's some like there. It's very corny. I think the most one of the most gruesome deaths in the movie that I actually like is probably when he uh, burns the one of the nurses by sticking her face into the jacuzzi when it's like up to like 100
Right.
or something. I think that, while it is that I think that's definitely on the gorier side. There's something so like horrifying about that. So I give them credit for that. But yeah, they definitely upped the gore factor, and you know,
But
for
even
better or
then,
for
I don't
worse.
think it ever went like too over the top with it.
Not compared to most. No, yeah, not compared. Especially not compared to the Friday the 13th films. I think they kind of took it to the limit, as far as it could go. I think overall it's a fine movie. Donald Pleasance is still a lot of fun in it. Jamie Lee Curtis she's there. I can't really say much for her performance because she kind of doesn't really do very much. It would have been. I have a lot more to say about her return to the franchise in H2O, but this kind of just felt like you can tell this was a contractual thing, and I don't think she was very interested in being there. But regardless, it's a fun movie, and I like some. I'm not really in love with the cast of characters that they put in her place, but they're at least a diverse enough crew that they all feel like they all feel like distinct people. So I'm like, I give credit for that, but you could tell from the opening of the movie that they wanted to create a more vicious Michael Myers when he randomly, brutally kills that girl in the trailer park for no apparent reason, just because I guess, maybe to kick off the adrenaline of being shot 6 times. But
I think it was to like find himself a new knife because I think he had was
He lost his, yeah.
yeah
Yes, overall, I like two. It was obviously going to be a step down from one, no matter what. But
yeah
it's
yeah.
still a pretty solid film, I think.
I like it okay, but it's not one that I'm gonna watch a whole lot.
Yeah,
So as we said before, that was supposed to be the last of the Halloween movies featuring Michael Myers as John Carpenter and producer Mustafa Akkad
yeah,
decided, we want each subsequent movie after that to deal with an entirely different story. So,
yeah.
so that's where we get Halloween 3, Season of the Witch, one of the most polarizing movies of the series. And, you can kind of see why, but, I have to admit that this is a movie that does get a little better each time I watch it. The only thing that really doesn't make sense is basically just the story.
Yeah, I have to preface this. I really give credit to the producers of the movie for choosing to go an anthological route because at the time they had, while Nightmare on Elm Street and while the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise and the actually had Nightmare on Elm Street kicked off yet?
No, that hadn't happened yet.
All right. Well, but while a lot of these horror films, were creating sort of their own iconography, they had an iconic character. They had a marquee character, and they kind of accepted that he was dead and decided to move on, which is really ballsy to do. I mean, nowadays you can get away with that because people are hungry for more experimental horror, but back then, they wanted their monster, and to go into production on a third Halloween movie with no Michael Myers at all, not even a story that takes place in Haddonfield, not even a story that has any connection to Michael Myers, was really ballsy. So I give them all the credit in the world to the late Mustafa Akkad and all of them who worked on it. Also, the director of the film, Tommy
Tommy
Lee
Lee
Wallace,
Wallace.
he was one of Carpenter's longtime buddies, and he's a really damn good director. So the movie is well directed, and I liked that he wanted to go more of an Invasion of the Body Snatchers route, and he wanted to go with more about paranoia, and I appreciated the allegory for commercialism. Essentially, the holiday of Halloween kills children is what the movie is saying. That commercialism and greed and corporate ownership of this holiday is essentially murdering these children. A bit heavy handed, sure, but I mean, like, wow, to go from a movie about a guy in a white mask who kills horny teenagers to a story where it's, about commercialism in America killing children was like, wow, that's quite a jump. So I'm with you. The movie, like as a kid, I had no interest. I watched it out of curiosity, didn't care for it. And then as the years went on, I'm like, you know what? Let me watch it on its own merits. I shouldn't be judging it even though it is a Halloween film, I shouldn't be judging it in the Michael Myers Chronicles. So watching it again, I like it a lot. I like Tom Atkins in it a lot. I love Daniel O'Herlihy, who plays the villain Cochran in the movie. He's really good. I just in that jingle, God, that
Oh
horrible
my
TV jingle.
God.
It's still stuck in my head. I think that was the point. I think the whole point of the movie was to just to ruin everybody with that horrible jingle, and if that's the case, it succeeds.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
on the whole, I think it's a fine movie on its own. I mean, if you were to take it just simply as a film and match it up against a lot of the sequels, it fares better than a lot of the actual sequels. So overall, I think it's pretty decent.
Yeah, I think there's a lot more to say about it in terms of just when and why certain things happen. And going by what you said about the body snatchers feel, it was a nice tribute to make the name of the town where all this action takes place called Santa Mira, which was the name of the town in the original Invasion of the Body
Yeah.
Snatchers.
Yeah, no, it's yeah, you can tell there's a lot of tender love and care put into this movie. I think Tommy Lee Wallace had a really interesting idea, and he took it home, and I think that I think it plays out well. It's a bit of the pace is a bit slow. It's not exactly the most exciting film, but I think the story overall is kind of what sells it. It is a bit it is ham-fisted, like I said, but
Yeah.
I think that the kind of the there's something provocative about the masks being the monster of the movie, that the masks are what's killing these children. You know that I appreciate how kind of overboard it is. I think that I think it was, like I said, it was a risky idea, but I think overall I think it's a pretty solid movie.
It's just the way that things happen that it's just kind of weird at times. Seeing the first guy in the suit who kills the guy at the hospital, and then he just seeing him get into a car and just set himself on fire and just blow the car up. Just ends up looking really awkward and funny to me, and to have Stonehenge pieces be a part of this whole thing felt really strange too.
Yeah, it is a quirky movie. That's for damn sure. And yeah, there are some B movie elements to it, but that once again, it's like looking at older films. When you look at things that kind of make you chuckle a little bit, you have to think about the people behind it and make you wonder: was that intentional? Were they being clever? Or were they being dead serious, and I'm just not taking it the right way? So it becomes an interesting conversation that way. So yeah, there definitely there is a major quirk factor to this movie.
Yeah, and now for as iconic as the first movie is, one thing that this movie does better is that it actually showcases Halloween more. I mean,
Yeah,
the first movie was originally just going to be called the Babysitter Murders, but
which is a terrible title, by the way.
and they just decided to add in after the fact. Well, let's have this set on Halloween,
Yeah,
and in this movie, Halloween's everywhere. All the costumes and jack o' lanterns and everything, and it basically becomes a character, and ends up being almost sort of the villain in a way for reasons that you explained upon earlier.
yeah. Yeah, no, yeah, Dewey actually making Halloween a character in the movie. It's kind of ironic because I was talking about this movie with a friend not long ago, and I was saying, if you just simply remove Halloween 3 from the title, just call it the Season of the Witch, it probably would fare a lot better. But then I'm like, ironically enough, this is one of the few Halloween movies that actually utilizes the holiday, so it also kind of feels wrong to even think about removing the Halloween moniker from it. Um, so I think I do agree. I think that using Halloween as not just as a really strong backdrop, but like I said, Halloween, the holiday, essentially is the monster of the movie. So I think that's a pretty, like I said, it's a pretty ballsy move. Also to go from a creepy, silent, methodical killer in the darkness to a corporate man in a suit. I mean, people tell you nowadays there's probably very little difference between the two of them. So I do like, once again, going back to that word, there's something provocative about it. Going from it's you could tell American Horror Story definitely has a lot to thank for these films, because they have gone the anthological route, and each one is different from the last, but you know uh, they create different kinds of monsters in each story. So I appreciate what Tommy Lee Wallace was trying to do with this movie, and I think that this was Carpenter making it up to him, because I think Wallace was supposed to do Halloween 2, but then once he found out the story that Carpenter was writing for it, he decided he didn't want to direct that, which I think is really ballsy on his part too, to say, I'm gonna say no to directing one of the most anticipated sequels of the decade because I'm just not into the script. So and this clearly was more his speed, and it just kind of turns out to that, for the fates, it just worked out better. I think that it's a, like I said, on its own, I think it's a pretty good movie.
Yeah, I do agree with what you said that some of the acting is very good, like from Tom Atkins and actually the actress who played Ellie, Stacey Nelkin. I think she was really good in it too. But
Yeah.
and you mentioned Dan O'Herlihy. One of my favorite moments from him. Again, it's just a really small moment, but it's toward the end when they're destroying the machines that they had there, and Cochrane looks up and sees what they've done, and he just kind of smiles and like gives a little clap for them.
Yeah, yeah, it's terrifying that the calmness of Daniel Hurley in that role. It's like he doesn't lose his temper. He doesn't he's very cold and methodical. And yeah, it's the fear of like he's one step ahead, so he doesn't really have a whole lot to be concerned about. You could tell his end game is probably something that goes beyond his own mortality. So he's a compelling villain. And I had actually read somewhere that Daniel Farrens, who wrote the sixth film, actually was going to incorporate Cochrane into the Cult of Thorn to tie all the films together. Which, while that film is absolutely ridiculous, it would have been really interesting to see them try to rope Season of the Witch into the mythology to see it all come together. But that's neither here nor there.
Especially considering that in this movie that there are scenes when characters are watching the original Halloween on TV.
Yeah, that definitely doesn't help. This isn't a comic book movie where you can do theories of a multiverse, or at least you really shouldn't bring something like that into a horror film. But yeah, I actually think I haven't seen the film in a few years, so I think I'm gonna go back and give it another watch soon.
Yeah, this used to be a movie that I didn't really care too much about. I've never owned it, but the more I watch it, the more I kind of think, this might be worth putting on every once in a while. I do still think it's very odd and offbeat, but I like that it's gotten a certain cult following over the years, where it was misjudged for a long time, but now it's gotten a better reputation.
Yeah, absolutely. It certainly has found its audience now. I actually think it's surprisingly, growing up, it was popular to say three was the worst, but nowadays, it's similar to going back to the Bond franchise. Was On Her Majesty's Secret Service, the one Bond film with George Lazenby, that was notoriously known as the worst one. But as the years have gone on, people are revisiting it, and for me personally, I think it's one of the best. And a lot of people are seeing that now. It's just some films just they come out at the wrong time. This movie came out, it didn't really find it didn't find its audience, but years later, it's discovered it. So good on them. I'm glad that the film finally found a home.